For ages, the burning of the Library of Alexandria has conjured this powerful image, hasn't it? This devastating loss that maybe, just maybe, set humanity back centuries.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those historical moments everyone sort of knows or thinks they know.
And you can't help but wonder, right? Could we have, I don't know, skipped ahead somehow if it survived? It's a sticky question.
It really is. And that image, flames eating knowledge, it's potent. So for this deep dive, we've pulled together some really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, insights from like online discussions, historical analyses, even looking at it through the lens of math history. We want to kind of peel back the layers on this for you.
Exactly. Our mission isn't just to mourn a loss, but to really understand it. What was actually in the library? How did knowledge even survive back then?
And ultimately, what was the real impact? Did its destruction fundamentally change our path?
Okay, so starting point. This idea of a massive library. It sounds permanent, almost eternal. But one thing that jumped out at me from the research is just how fragile ancient knowledge really was.
That's a crucial point, yeah. I saw some discussion about this, how just, having the texts wasn't enough. Papyrus. That was their main medium.
Right. Not exactly acid-free paper.
Not at all. Think about old paper now, how brittle it gets. Papyrus was even more susceptible. Handling it, humidity, bugs, it decayed.
So keeping information alive meant constantly recopying everything by hand.
Exactly. Painstakingly. It wasn't like hitting save. It was this continuous human effort.
And someone pointed out online, it wasn't just the physical effort, but the social commitment.
Right. You needed scribes, you needed resources, you needed society to value that preservation work.
So even without a single flame, if that commitment faded.
The knowledge could just disappear anyway, slowly fade out.
Kind of makes you think about today, doesn't it? Our digital stuff. We assume it's forever, but...
But is it? What if the will to maintain the servers, the formats, what if that goes? It's a similar challenge, just, faster maybe.
Someone else took that even further, thinking really long term.
Oh, yeah, the idea that even clay tablets, things we think of as super durable, they won't last forever on, like, geological timescales.
And we see it even now. VCR tapes, CDs, already becoming obsolete, hard to read.
It's a constant battle against decay, isn't it? Fire or no fire. That person even joked, maybe the only way to truly archive things long-term is to become multiplanetary.
Short chuckle. Puts our worries in perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, but back to Alexandria. There's this really powerful myth, isn't there? That the library held unique, almost secret knowledge.
Uh-huh. The kind of stuff that would have given us a massive technological leap.
Yeah, exactly. The whole, you'd have spaceships by the Renaissance idea. It's romantic.
It is. But when you dig into the historical analysis, especially some of the really detailed discussions, a different picture emerges.
Less unique than we think.
Probably. The consensus seems to be that, yeah, it was huge, it was important, but a lot of the works it held. You could likely find copies in other big libraries around the Roman world.
Okay, that makes sense. Knowledge spreads.
It does, and it wasn't like this single vault nobody else had access to.
And what about that scientific revolution idea? That they were right on the verge?
Well, that's another key point that comes up in those analyses. There was a pretty significant gap back then between natural philosophy, like thinking about the world, and actual technology.
So science and making stuff were kind of separate worlds.
Largely, yeah. Thinking about nature, that was often for the elite, the scholars. Very theoretical. Building things, engineering, crafts, that was more the domain of artisans.
People working with their hands, maybe not reading the philosophical scroll.
Exactly. There wasn't that strong feedback loop we see later, where scientific discovery directly drives technological innovation, and vice versa. That connection, that systematic experimentation.
Like comes much later, like medieval times, early modern period.
Precisely. That's when you really start to see the deliberate application of scientific methods to solve practical problems and technology feeding back into science.
Yeah.
The Greeks and Romans just weren't quite there yet, culturally or methodologically.
So having the ideas wasn't enough. You needed the whole system, the mindset, to turn them into, I don't know, steam engines.
You got it. Now, another thing often simplified is the actual destruction. It wasn't just one big bonfire, right?
No, not at all. The history suggests it was messier. Multiple events.
Definitely. There's pretty good evidence for an accidental fire during Julius Caesar's siege in Alexandria. That likely did some damage.
Okay, so that's one incident.
Then there's talk of damage during later Roman conflicts under emperors like Caracalla or Aurelian or Diocletian. Sieges are messy things.
Right, libraries aren't usually fireproofed against armies.
And then there's the destruction of the Serapeum. That was a different site, a temple complex that also had a library, kind of a daughter library.
But it often gets conflated with the main Great Library.
Yeah, they get lumped together in the popular imagination, but its destruction was a separate event later on.
And wasn't the library's importance also kind of fading by some of those later dates?
That's another factor. As Rome became the absolute center of the empire, the intellectual gravity started shifting.
Alexandria wasn't the only game in town anymore.
No, and other libraries were popping up, even in Alexandria itself. Plus, getting into the Mautian, the research institute connected to the library, and apparently became less about pure scholarship and more about, political connections.
So its prestige maybe wasn't what it once was when some of the later damage occurred.
Seems that way. It wasn't necessarily the single, undisputed heart of global knowledge by that point.
Okay, so a more complex picture.
Yeah.
Less unique, gradual decline, multiple hits over centuries. But it was still a major center. What kind of knowledge was the focus there? What were the scholars actually doing?
Well, historical analyses suggest the focus was heavily on what we'd now call the humanities.
Like literature, philosophy.
Very much so. Poetry was huge, especially analyzing Homer, trying to establish the correct versions of classic texts. Lots of work on grammar, language structure.
Lexicography? Like making dictionaries.
Exactly. And rhetoric, the art of speaking and writing effectively, these were core disciplines.
So less about, say, building machines or discovering new laws of physics.
It seems that way. There was proto-science, philosophical inquiry into nature, but it tended to be quite abstract, quite metaphysical.
Thinking about the fundamental nature of things rather than experimenting.
Pretty much. It wasn't typically geared towards practical application or testing hypotheses in the way modern science is.
But they must have had some way to organize all those scrolls, right? It wasn't just a giant pile.
Oh, absolutely not. They had a remarkably advanced system, actually. A scholar named Callimachus developed something called the Pinacies.
Pinacies?
Yeah, it was essentially a comprehensive library catalog. Think scrolls organized by subject, poetry, medicine, history, math.
Wow, like a Dewey Decimal System for scrolls.
Kind of. It was groundbreaking. A bibliography, really. They even apparently tagged scrolls with title, author, subject. They were serious about managing the information.
Okay, so very organized, focus heavily on literature, textual analysis, language, but maybe not the hotbed of revolutionary science we sometimes imagine.
That seems to be the more accurate picture, yeah.
So if that's the case, what was the real loss? If it wasn't necessarily unique scientific secrets, what did humanity lose when those scrolls were destroyed or decayed over time?
Well, even if it wasn't full of unique scientific blueprints, the sheer volume of literary and historical work from that Hellenistic period that vanished, it's staggering.
You mean like plays, poems, histories we don't even know existed?
Exactly. Some analyses mention thousands of authors, countless works, figures maybe even more prolific than Aristotle whose stuff just gone. It's a massive hole in our understanding of that whole era's culture and thought.
Right. So not just scientific data, but cultural data. Someone online made the point that we lost so much context.
Yeah, clues about daily life, historical events, different perspectives, the nuances of culture. Even if the core scientific principles known then survived elsewhere, you lose all that richness.
It's like losing a huge chunk of a civilization's collective memory.
Precisely. And someone else drew a parallel. Imagine if we lost the internet today.
Whoa.
Yeah. It's not just the scientific databases, right? It's the blogs, the forums, the news archives, the personal stories. Just this vast, interconnected web. Losing that would be a catastrophic setback, even if basic science textbooks survived.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. It's the breadth, the context, the connections.
Exactly.
Now, something else that came up in the discussions, and it feels important, is the risk of being too Eurocentric about this, focusing only on Alexandria.
Yes, that's a vital point. While Alexandria and the Greco-Roman world were obviously important, framing history only around their losses gives a skewed view.
Because major things were happening elsewhere.
Absolutely. During the same period, and especially in the centuries that correspond to the European Middle Ages, you had incredible intellectual and technological flourishing in Asia, China, the Islamic world, India.
So human progress wasn't solely dependent on scrolls in Egypt.
Not by a long shot. You had vibrant trade and intellectual exchange across the Indian Ocean, for instance, flourishing civilizations, major advancements happening completely outside that Mediterranean sphere.
And thinking about preservation, too. China, for example, has incredibly long and detailed historical records.
Exactly. A different tradition, perhaps, but one that resulted in remarkably continuous records compared to the more fragmented picture we sometimes have from ancient Europe. It just reminds you, history is global. Progress isn't a single track.
It's a really crucial perspective shift. But even with the losses in Alexandria, knowledge isn't always completely lost forever, is it? There was that quote someone shared.
From Stoppard's Arcadia?
Yeah.
About shedding knowledge as we pick it up, like travelers.
Yeah, that one. What we let fall will be picked up by those behind.
It speaks to a certain resilience, doesn't it? Important ideas, useful knowledge. It tends to get copied, it spreads. It might take different paths, but it often resurfaces.
And we're still finding things, aren't we?
Yeah.
Pictures of newly discovered papyri fragments keep popping up.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process of recovery and rediscovery. Not all is lost.
Which connects to modern efforts, too, right? Like that Rosetta project somebody mentioned, trying to create super long-lasting archives because we know our current digital stuff is fragile.
Yeah, learning from the past, trying to avoid repeating those losses on a potentially larger scale now.
There was also a point made about a different kind of loss, not just scientific or historical texts, but art, cultural heritage.
Right. Things like the Bamiyan Buddhas being destroyed or artworks lost in fires or wars. It's a different kind of knowledge, maybe.
Yeah.
A loss of human expression, of beauty, of cultural identity that's profound in its own way.
It's not just data, it's spirit, maybe. Soul.
Something like that. It hits differently.
Okay, one last area to touch on, specifically mathematics. Because the Greeks made huge leaps there, didn't they? Both before and during the library's heyday.
Oh, absolutely. You had foundational figures like Thales doing early geometry, maybe even predicting an eclipse, which was pretty wild for the time.
And the Pythagoreans.
Huge influence. That emphasis on rigorous proof, on deduction, number theory, laying groundwork for so much that followed.
And Euclid, of course. The elements.
Yeah, Euclid's Elements is just monumental. That axiomatic method, starting with basic self-evident truths or definitions and logically driving everything else, that shaped Western thought for millennia.
And Archimedes, wasn't he connected to Alexandria?
He was, yes, associated with the intellectual scene there, and his work was incredible. Early calculus concepts, levers, buoyancy, estimating pi, real mathematical physics beginning to take shape.
So these massive mathematical advances were happening, but were they dependent on the library itself?
Well, the library was certainly a center where scholars gathered and worked, but these ideas were part of a broader intellectual current across the Greek world. Euclid and Archimedes were giants, but their work built on and contributed to a wider mathematical landscape. It wasn't solely confined within the library walls.
And that axiomatic method Euclid championed had repercussions far beyond geometry.
Right. Immense repercussions. I mean, centuries later, challenging one of Euclid's axioms leads to non-Euclidean geometry.
Which turns out to be crucial for Einstein's theory of relativity.
Exactly. It shows how these foundational ideas ripple outwards. And then you get Gödel in the 20th century showing the inherent limits of these formal systems. It's this ongoing conversation built on those Greek foundations.
Mind-bending stuff. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Bringing it all together, what's the main takeaway? Did the burning of the Library of Alexandria really derail humanity?
Well, our deep dive suggests it's complicated. The destruction, likely multiple events over time, was definitely a major loss. A huge loss of texts, cultural heritage, a center of learning.
But maybe not the single catastrophic event that threw us off course for centuries.
Probably not in the way the myth suggests. The idea that it contained unique, world-altering scientific knowledge that was utterly lost seems largely unsupported, and that narrative often overlooks progress elsewhere and misunderstands how ancient science and tech actually worked.
Right. It reflects maybe a more Eurocentric view, and doesn't count for the fragility of knowledge anyway, or the separate tracks of philosophy and practical craft back then.
Exactly. Preservation has always been hard, and breakthroughs happen in many places, many times. It wasn't all riding on one library.
So a final thought for people listening.
Maybe think about our own libraries today. Digital, physical, cultural. What are their vulnerabilities? What's our social commitment now to keeping knowledge safe and accessible for the future?
It's still a light side, isn't it? This tension between creating, losing, preserving, and rediscovering. The journey just continues.